This is the second part of my Advanced Awilix guide. If you haven't watched the first part yet, please click here or click the card above in order to get there first. This part will be discussing the rest of the items and their viability for Awilix. Frostbound Hammer. Frostbound Hammer is, in my opinion, completely overrated on Awilix. Frostbound Hammer is a great item, don't get me wrong. Power is nice, health is nice, slow is nice. But Awilix doesn't really need that. When it comes to defenses, she will often need specific defenses against specific kinds of characters. Health is still nice, but there are better items if you want health. And the slow does not seem necessary to me. Awilix has many means of closing gaps, as you've seen before in this video, and she has an insane lockdown potential on a target. She has insane follow-up potential on a target. So slowing the enemy is only really useful for your team. In that regard, you probably shouldn't buy it. There should be other characters in your team that may get it, but as Awilix, not so much. It's an okay item. Don't judge you if you buy it, but I don't think it's that good. Crusher. Crusher is good because of power, penetration, and so on. And the passive is really nice because Awilix actually has decent split push potential with her ultimate. However, I would mostly buy Brawler's Beatstick over it because Brawler's Beatstick just offers more in terms of team fight potential, in terms of shutting specific characters down, and in terms of shutting hunters down. If you want to go for a full ability build with Jotun's Wrath, Titan's Bane, Brawlers, and the Crusher, sure, go for it. That scenario is very, very good, but you will rarely do that because you usually need some other items as well. In that sense, Brawler's Beatstick, same item, better stats, basically, a little more expensive. I think this is a great item for Awilix, especially when bought in mid-game, when the enemy team doesn't build too many defenses. The moment the enemy team goes into multiple, like, Dynasty Playtime, Breastplate of Valor, Shifter's Shield, and all that stuff, Titan's Bane becomes more efficient because it's simply cheaper, and it has the percentage penetration, and late-game Titan's Bane will always be better due to the base defenses of the enemy. So I would mostly recommend getting this before the enemy gets too many defenses. Jotun's Wrath should always be your priority choice, so simply because Jotun's Wrath offers a lot more for Awilix. We will talk about crit in a specific scenario, so we'll leave that out for now. Runeforged Hammer is not great for Awilix. She does not have a built-in slow, so don't even think about it, I would say. Simple as that. That is something for characters that have a slow. Shifter's Shield. Shifter's Shield, underrated for a long time. I think it's very good for Awilix. I think this item does well for her and can help her with having a little bit of defense, having a little bit of extra power. Can even work in synergy with Void Shield. So definitely not a bad choice in my eyes, but situational because it doesn't have stuff like penetration or cooldown reduction. Transcendence. I cannot stress this enough. Do not build Transcendence on Awilix in the jungle. If you want to build Transcendence on Awilix in solo, so be it. Go for it. I don't mind. In the jungle, this is a pretty bad item because it takes you forever to stack. It's nice for Awilix to get that extra mana. It's nice to get that extra power. But overall, in the bigger picture of things, you want the power and penetration, which is better than other items. And late game, there will be better items for DPS again. So there's no point in which this is justified to be the best item. As Awilix, you want to fight early on. You don't want to stay in the jungle and farm. You want to emphasize on your lead as much as possible. I know that some pro players like this item, but mathematically it doesn't make zero sense. The only reason you're building it for is the mana. And if you learn how to properly manage your mana with Awilix and get some blue pots in there, I don't think it is needed. Void Shield we already talked about. Crit, once again, we'll do later. Concise, we'll do in a attack speed section. Bloodforge is okay. Has very high power. Is what I would get in place of Transcendence if we're talking about getting like a raw high power build. And it gives her some more late game snowball potential. But overall, I think it is not the greatest item. I've talked about this before. I think the problem here is that she needs to get a kill and not an assist. Stone-Cutting Sword, on the other hand, is amazing for Awilix. It has high power. It has movement speed. Both nice stats for Awilix. And on top of that, you get Protection Shred. If you combine this and Executioner, you basically have old Executioner bad because you get flat penetration or flat protection reduction along with the percentage reduction from Executioner. If you throw a Void Shield on top of that, you have a ridiculous amount of protection shred. And that helps not only you, but also your team. She will always get those 2 hits before the Feather Step. So you get most of the reduction beforehand. And that just makes it such a great item. It is very expensive. It's a late game luxury item in my eyes, but it's well worth it often. Relish and Deathbringer for the crit section. With that, move on to attack speed. We've talked about the Igvail briefly. Don't need to go into that anymore. We can actually skip the lifesteal items as well. We talk about them separately. But let's talk about Winged Blade. Winged Blade, I think, is a great item for Awilix, even though it is not the best. It has health, which is, like I said, a nice start, a good stat for her. It has crowd control reduction, something not too many items have. Cooldown reduction would obviously be better for Awilix, but it's still nice to not be locked down that long. It has a bit of attack speed, which is nice. It has movement speed, which is very nice. And the passive is what makes this item. The fact that it's very cheap, and it has this passive and some health, can make it well worth it. If you get, for example, this and Void Shield, then you have a decent amount of tankiness as an assassin, which is always great. Only buy this if the enemy team requires you to get enough anti-slow. Ritual Dagger is a great item, I think. Is by stats better for Awilix than Winged Blade. A little less health, but you get cooldown reduction, which is great for Awilix. You get more attack speed, which is good. You get movement speed still. And you have that nice passive. I think the passive is good as long as you have the right items for it. Every item that has an increased duration it is great for. And it's very cheap. So getting this mid-game can help you unless you need more burst, which will often be the case. So think about your choices. Think about if you will need it. And then adapt to it and maybe buy it. But keep in mind that you want to sell it late game most of the time. Lifesteal once again. Witchblade. I've talked about this in a recent video. I don't think this is a great item. And it's especially not for characters like Awilix. The stats here are not relevant enough to her in most scenarios. Tied with the price tag. It's a solid item, but I wouldn't buy it on Awilix. Hasten Fatalis. Completely unnecessary for Awilix. You do not need the sticking power. And if you need the sticking power, then you get Frostbound. Frostbound is better for Awilix than Hasten Fatalis in every sense you could think of. Do not get Hasten Fatalis ever. And the last 2 items here, Odysseus Bow. Odysseus Bow is nice for late game DPS, but it's more for hunters and specific AA focused characters. Awilix has better attack speed options, so I don't see a reason to buy it. I really don't. Concise, however, is a great item. Concise is insanely good in terms of DPS, and Awilix does not have too much DPS. She has more high burst, and then the damage is just, basics. After her ultimate runs out, there's not much left. In late game, there are better boxes than her. And if you're against a comp that boxes late game, then you can consider Concise. Concise works well in combination with Executioner, and it generally works well in combination with any kind of protection reduction. So you can build this. I don't think it's necessarily a go-to choice in many situations, but if you're against a tanky comp or a comp that requires you to box a lot and stay in fights for longer periods of time, then I think Concise is good on Awilix. Also, the point with the attack speed is always that it accelerates the time it takes for you to get to your second point of Feather Step, so to speak, second hit of Feather Step. So in that regard, it's also great. Moving on to Lifesteal. We've talked about Devils briefly. I don't think it's good because of stacks. We've talked about Bloodforge because it's nice for the power. What about the other two? Soul Eater get a nerf. It's not OP anymore, and because of that, I would say it's not that great for Awilix. Once again, I need stacks, so that's kind of annoying. If you want a secondary or a first lifesteal item in your kit, rather, I would recommend AC. Unless we're talking very, very late game and you need a lot of power, then Bloodforge is better. But if you need it at some point in between, you feel like you just need to box. While you shouldn't box most of the time, you should just kill before boxing even happens, but sometimes you just do. Then AC is great. It has that flat penetration, which is very good because it also helps with your other, with your ability damage. It has some attack speed, it has some lifesteal, and it has a really nice passive. Passive that can, for example, be combined with Bulwark as well. And because Awilix is one of the few characters that does well with both items, the passive have better synergy than they would on a Hunter, for example, because you just can't buy Bulwark on a Hunter. So overall, RC is a good item if you want lifesteal. Generally, I avoid lifesteal on the Awilix most of the time. I don't think it's that necessary. You're more of a burst character and not a sustainer, but sometimes it can be good. I think we've covered every item in penetration. Let me just check back. Yes, we have. Moving on to crit chance. Crit chance is somewhat of a niche option for Awilix, and I will tell you to ditch Rage right away. Rage is not a good crit item for Awilix. You're not going to be hitting targets often enough for that to be worth it. It doesn't have much power. So, 3 items left. Now, the point with crit is best when you have 2 items of it. Then it's really bring out the hot DPS numbers. Can Awilix provide that? Maybe. Sometimes it can be done. Often you will need more defense in your kit or more cooldown reduction or something like that for it to be worth it. If you have the possibility to go for 1 crit item late game and you really want to do it, then it should be Malice. Malice has the highest DPS, so it works very well. At the same time, many people prefer Deathbringer for the crit that immediately gets scaled higher, and the way it works with the Awilix passive. So, in the end, between those two, the choice is pretty insignificant. If you actually have the option to go for 2 crit items, I would recommend going for Wind Demon and Deathbringer. Typically, you would go for Wind Demon first and Deathbringer second. If you have the gold, in this case, you might actually consider switching it out, simply because Awilix scales well with the power from Deathbringer, and Deathbringer has higher power than Wind Demon, while it's also more expensive. But that random crit could be very nice. If you actually manage to get both, you get some nice stats, some high power, high crit chance, and extra attack speed and movement speed, which all works very well for Awilix. So it's not an option that I would completely throw out of the window. It's just a very rare occurrence that you're actually capable of building both. With that, we'll run to the defensive section. Let's just quickly check which items we haven't talked about. Emperor's Armor, nah, should not be built on Awilix. There are better teammates, there are better characters for it, because it has relatively weak defensive stats in comparison to other items for the price, so no. Sovereignty should only be built if no one else on your team is building it and you really, really need the physical defense, so pretty much never. Spectral Armor is in kind of a weird spot. I could imagine some trick build for it, simply trying to get Feather Step off twice in a very quick succession by using a relic. But the problem here is that you have to use a relic, and I really don't like the thought of using a relic in order to get the effect, because it often means you have to use a defensive relic. If you went for Wrath, then this item can do some brutal work. If you go for a Feather Step onto the enemy, then stun them with Wrath, and then shortly afterwards you Feather Step them away again, that's actually pretty brutal. The problem is that often your defensive options will also be a cooldown reduction options. So that means if you're going into Spectral Armor, you basically lose cooldown reduction in order to get that cooldown reduction active or passive by activating a relic. So it's kind of a make it or break it situation where you really have to emphasize on that and find another way to integrate more cooldown reduction into your kit, or go double defense, which will lower your damage in return, which then makes a double Feather Step a lot less impactful than if you had a higher damage build. So maybe with Hydras or something like that this could work, but it's very, very, very niche. Then again, if you get it going, you can have a ridiculous amount of CC onto a target, especially if you hit the 3 first, because it has a knockup, so it doesn't have diminishing returns. The Nemean Lion is actually not too bad on Awilix. It is nice because it has mana, it is nice because it has a high amount of physical protection, and it has that nice passive. If you're against heavy hunters and you need some defense late game, I think this is a viable choice. Not always the best, but a viable choice. In the same sense, Midgardian. If you already have some protection and you just need that health and you need something to trade hunters or other AA carries, then Midgardian is also good. Niche picks, mostly because you don't often go into much defense, but well worth it. Then we got my favorite in terms of physical protection aside of the ones that also have damage. Respite of Valor. It's great because it has mana, it's great because it has cooldown reduction, and a lot of that, and it has some physical defense. Most of the time, you would build that, and you can combine it with Void Shield for a ridiculous amount of physical defense. Mage's Blessing, very situational. It doesn't have the best stats. but if you need to get rid of some specific CC against a character that heavily relies on his CC, then this can be good. For example, against the Tyr. Hide of the Urchin is an interesting item on junglers. I like it, but I don't think it's necessarily the best for Awilix. I would rarely recommend it because it takes so long to stack, and while you can get it if you're ahead, you don't need that much defense either. So often I would prefer a choice with cooldown reduction. Shift the shield we talked about. Spirit Robe is one of those items that I really like on Awilix. It has mixed defenses, it has crowd control reduction, and it has cooldown reduction on top of that. Additionally, it has a really nice passive that is often underrated. So I think Spirit Robe is definitely one of the better defensive items for Awilix, and it doesn't get picked up nearly as often as it was anymore, while I still think it's one of the very strong ones. We talked about Void Shield. Mystical Mail is not for Awilix. She does not need that, or her damage from other sources, from her own physical damage is much, much higher. So Mystical Mail would just be a waste of a slot when you look at the price tag and what it really offers. Mantle of Discord, though, is a very nice second defensive item or late game defensive item. I would generally prefer this over Spirit Robe because it has higher base defenses and it has that nice passive. Also, it has higher cooldown, but it's more expensive too, quite a significant amount. So keep that in mind when making the choice between the two. I would generally often buy this item as the 5th or 6th slot in order to have some extra defense. Also, once again, mixed defense there, which is great. Look at the ones we haven't looked at here. Only Hunter's Garb is kind of interesting. It's kind of nice in theory. It has that nice MP5 as well, which allows you to roam a little more as Awilix and spam Suku a little more. But the applications for it are limited because it does not have that much defense or health, and the stacks eventually go away. And looking at this item here, we also have 60 magical defense here, but we have an additional 200 health, and we have 20% counter renewal reduction, and we have a pretty crazy passive that gives you an extra shield, which is more than 200 health in most scenarios. So kind of the better choice in many situations. So I would say Only Hunter simply falls flat compared to Bulwark, and that's why it's not that great for Awilix. Then we have Hardwood, which should only be bought if no one else buys Hardwood. Same going for Pestilence, though I could justify that a little more on Awilix. If you just feel like you need that anti-heal in your team on maybe a second character as well, and you need magical defense at the same time, but not as much as Bulwark would provide you with in total defense, then why not Pestilence? Runic Shield, we have talked about this. Genji's Guard. Genji's Guard is basically, in many senses, the magical equivalent to Breastplate of Valor, and I think it's a great item for Awilix. It has high magic protection, it has cooldown reduction on top of that, and it has that passive that reduces your cooldown even more, so it allows you to be ultra aggressive while giving you MP5. This is the aggressive magical defense choice compared to Bulwark being the defensive magical defense choice that I would go for most of the time if I'm purely focusing on magical defense. Then we have the mixed options here. We've talked about all these. I think all of them are good to some extent, but we're talking about raw magical defense right here. When looking at the health item, I just need to quickly check if I'm missing anything. We have Gauntlet of Thebes here, which you will never buy on Awilix. It doesn't make sense. We have Stone of Gaia, which is actually seeing some more play now. It has made a bit of a comeback because it has some really nice sustain, and it's not completely trash for Awilix, especially because it has MP5 as well. I just said Awilix, that's terrible. Awilix. And overall, it's not completely bad, but it's not an item you would want to build on Awilix in most scenarios. It's only something that you would build if you have like really huge problems getting focused out and needing that sustain, which is very, very rare. Other than that, we've looked at all the items here as well. HP 5 should be nothing new anymore at this point, and aura items should also be checked. Movement speed items we have all gone over at this point. Cooldown reduction we have talked about. Once again, one of the most important stats for Awilix. Mana, generally very nice for Awilix, and MP5 in that regard also. But we have actually gone through all of these items. We've gone through the relics. We can take a quick look at the consumables. Obviously, you want wards, sentry wards whenever you can. They're much better than normal wards because they reveal where the enemy is. You will often get mana potions on the way, simply because it allows you to stay around longer, because you're not going to lose that much health, but you're going to lose a lot of mana. The new power potion, which unlocks at level 10, is great for Awilix. Buy it when you need it. Don't buy it just because you think it's OP. It is not OP. It gives you some extra damage, but it's not crazy. So choose wisely here. Buy it, definitely buy it over the Elixir of Power. It does a lot more than that. Elixir of Power is great though when you have the gold and you have nothing else to buy. I would often opt for Elixir of Defense over it though, simply because 50 protections late game can be a lot, depending on how much penetration the enemy team has built. Really depends on your playstyle. I like some more defensive items, so I would recommend that often, but both are absolutely fine. So that's it for the items. And with that, we're at the end of this guide. Thank you guys for watching. New videos every day. Hope to see you next time. Yxlov out.